Hello, our friends and followers, software asset management and FinOps experts. We are here back today, and hopefully some of you are software as a service providers. And the topic of today's event is Microsoft licensing for profitable SaaS delivery. And as the name implies, we will discuss the options for SaaS application hosting and managing the associated costs. And I need to make it clear from the start that this is not an advertisement for Microsoft. We don't sell Microsoft licensing. We don't sell Microsoft cloud services. We, as a company, have no material interest in, for example, dragging you all to Azure, whether you like it or not. If we mention Azure or we mention licensing options, this is purely from a neutral standpoint of managing the costs of licenses for various hosting scenarios, specifically for software as a service. It's all about you today. It's all about your costs and your profitability. What I'd like you to do today is I'd like to give you quite a detailed information-packed overview of various Microsoft licensing options, specifically for software as a service, in as many scenarios as possible that we encounter working with our clients. And I'd like to present it from the finance and cost management point of view as much as I can, but also mention traps and gotchas, any risks that may be associated with licensing and hosting of software as a service. So we'll give you the essence of thousands of pages of Microsoft licensing rules, and we'll try to do it in 1 hour, maybe shorter, if I manage. Everything that we've learned and applied practically in over 25 years in license management and FinOps. I want to start with SaaS application providers are rather unique. I've been advising service providers for nearly 10 years recently in my recent career. And then the last 3 years together with our team at SAMexpert. And I find that SaaS application developers and hosts are extremely fascinating. And if you have a SaaS application and you're listening to this, you may not even consider yourself a service provider. I know a few companies that have that mindset. However, did you know that the only Microsoft's licensing program specifically for service providers, there are more options than that, but the specific licensing program for service providers, SPLA, of which we talk a lot on our channels, it was designed to help SaaS developers. Microsoft used to call SaaS developers ISVs, independent software vendors. And when independent software vendors started developing online applications, even before it got a fancy name of SaaS, they asked Microsoft, how can we license Microsoft software for our own applications hosted on the web? And Microsoft came up with SPLA. So you may imagine how much focus Microsoft still gives to service providers and SaaS providers. However, these days they want everybody to move to Azure. But again, there are multiple options available to you. I need to warn you that the following will be quite intense and packed with information, so buckle up, get your notebooks and pens ready, and most importantly, I implore you to ask questions at any time during the live stream. I have a laptop here with my LinkedIn, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please use the live chat on YouTube. If you're listening on LinkedIn, this is an audio event on LinkedIn. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I hope I will notice it immediately, and I'll give you the mic, and you'll be able to ask a question live, as on radio. And by the way, if you're on YouTube, if at any time during the stream you decide to click like, it will help other people discover the stream, and I'll be extremely grateful for it. But let's move on. If any of you are FinOps geeks, let me give you an idea of what SaaS KPIs are affected by licensing and cloud costs, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. Some of the KPIs could be total spend, obviously, because licenses are and associated costs are your spend. It's not the income, it's the outcome, it's the outgoing costs. Then some of the other KPIs are cost per feature, cost per revenue ratio, and cost per customer. So these KPIs are mostly affected by your licensing cost, but the total list is about 20. And if you want to see the entire list of those FinOps KPIs for SaaS specifically, send me a DM. I'll share the link with you. It's not our document, it's a third party. I find that document pretty exhaustive. Before we go into even discussing Microsoft licensing, I'd like to start with the elephant in the room. There are without scenarios, without Microsoft. And why not? Because it's obvious. If you're developing a new application or converting your existing solutions, the cloud native path is the most cost-efficient path for your SaaS applications. You may consider, and I would encourage you to consider, instead of deploying virtual machines with a hosted application, when you are only developing it, or you want to convert your existing apps, upgrade them, think about cloud native, because that's the easiest path. Obviously, there may be licensable microservices. There may be, for example, a SQL Server managed instance. It's licensable. It's an almost cloud native service. I wouldn't call it completely cloud native, but it is. And therefore, because it's licensable, it probably has multiple licensing options, and some of those options may be cheaper than others. Or you can go entirely without Microsoft licenses or reduce your Microsoft licensing dependency, and there's nothing wrong with reducing your dependency on Microsoft and the costs that are associated with it. But going back to the subject of the event, since it talks about licensing, I want to set the scene first. What do we consider a proper software as a service for the purpose of today's event and for the purpose of Microsoft licensing? First and foremost, it's normally sold as a subscription of any kind to third parties. It's not an internal SaaS like a Power Apps application for internal users. It is either a web application that you use via a browser, or it's a mobile application. And it's accessed either directly or through an API. By no means at any point there's direct access to Microsoft products, including remote desktop. Yes, there are SaaS solutions that I would call SaaS solutions that may stream a traditional desktop application, legacy app, using technology like Citrix or RDP publishing. But for the purpose of what we're discussing today, it's a fringe case. It's a very rare case these days. And from the Microsoft licensing point of view, it has very limited options. So if any of you on today's event, if you have applications like that and you are looking for what options you have to license them, I would suggest just reaching out to me directly and we can discuss it with you. But we'll continue. So RDP, no RDP publishing in terms of Microsoft SaaS licensing. No indirect use of Microsoft Office. Maybe not that categorical. We still see Microsoft Office when we work with our clients as part of a legacy solution that could be even a web app, but behind the scenes, there's Microsoft Office. There's an instance of Office that does conversion, that does publishing, PDF conversion, something like it. Most of the time, it's either non-compliant, entirely non-compliant, or when it's compliant, it's not cost efficient. Why? I'll give you a very simple answer. Every user that that is authorized to access the web application, your SaaS application, or a mobile application, that has Office in the background behind the scenes, needs a monthly subscription license for Microsoft Office through SPLA. It's roughly between $15 and $20 per user per month, which you may need it, but have that considered. And also, it severely reduces your overall licensing options for your SaaS solution. it limits your licensing options and cost-saving options as well. Speaking of the limited options, you must be crystal clear before you consider various licensing options on who owns your SaaS IP, who owns the application, who developed it, whether you developed it or you licensed it, you inherited it, who owns the intellectual property for the SaaS application. If its application is licensed, you may still consider it SaaS, you may still host it, but you need to remember, and I will talk about it in more details a bit later, that so-called self-hosted option is not available to you, and many BYOL options, as a consequence, aren't available. In our experience, 95% of the clients we work with own their own IP, so it's again not a frequent case when an app is licensed from a third provider, from somebody who, instead of developing an application for a particular company, licensed it to that company. It's a very rare case. It still happens. Let's set the scene further. And the word is, it's complicated. You need to understand where you are hosted or you want to move. For example, if you are hosted today in your data center, but you want to be in Azure tomorrow or in AWS, then you need to consider both options and plan your licensing accordingly and the associated costs as well. So there are many cloud and licensing hosting scenarios. If you are Microsoft dependent by choice or by necessity, you already know that Microsoft wants everyone to go to Azure. You've had all these conversations. You may be a Microsoft partner. It's all about Azure. Why not? So as a result, we have the popular scenario of using Microsoft Azure and Microsoft licenses in Azure with the associated Azure costs. But many consider AWS a more SaaS native platform with all the AWS options. And when you're running your virtual machines with, say, Windows Server and SQL Server, it really makes little difference. But when you start integrating that solution with cloud native services, then AWS still provides more flexibility in my opinion, not so humble. Azure is catching up, and we already know some people that prefer Azure to AWS for hosting SaaS. Again, why not? We're not here to advertise either. And we can't avoid mentioning the difference for your licensing planning and cost planning between providers like Amazon, Google, and Alibaba, that specific list, and other hyperscalers like Oracle and Kyndryl, for example, and OVH, Aruba, any other service providers you may think of, Rackspace, Service.com, because Amazon, Google, and Alibaba are the so-called listed providers. Why are they called listed providers? There is a list published by Microsoft. And that list has been static since 2019, since October 2019. However, Microsoft does not guarantee that they won't change the list in the future and they won't add new providers to that list. Why is that important? Microsoft licenses that you bring to and even get from Google, Amazon, and Alibaba have specific licensing requirements. There's another scenario that is very frequent in our experience, which is just your own data center. You host it yourselves. You either have a physical location that you manage, or you rent the managed physical location from a data center provider, or you rent hardware that is dedicated to you. Then there's a scenario of shared machines, and there are differences between listed providers and any other providers. So non-Amazon, non-Google, non-Alibaba. And in addition to the above, you have various licensing options. And these options vary depending on where you are hosting. So the first and foremost, the obvious option in 2024, you just get license included services depending on the platform availability. You just rent the virtual machines, with licenses and you have no licenses of your own, it's a pay-as-you-go scenario. There are there are benefits of pay-as-you-go. You can always you can come and go at any time. You can switch on and off. You don't have to manage licenses. But the drawbacks of pay-as-you-go are usually around the costs of included licenses. In the majority of cases, licenses, Microsoft licenses acquired through different channels and then brought to cloud providers in the scenarios that are eligible and available on those platforms. In many cases, those licenses that are brought to a platform are cheaper than pay-as-you-go. Please be careful. These days, with the proliferation of CSP hosting, so-called CSP hosting, there may be options marketed as license included from a specific subset of infrastructure as a service providers that are called CSP hosters. Be aware that those are not truly license included. This is how they market it. The way it works is they still sell your license and they'll host it for you. So from the point of view of licensing, that is bring your own license, which brings me to the point of bring your own license. There are a few bring your own license options available, and as I said, in the majority of cases, properly managed BYOL, even for SaaS, may reduce your costs. The option that is available already for over 2 years, not over, just about 2 years, so the second anniversary will be in October, is flexible virtualization benefit, which applies to any license on a subscription or with software assurance. And I'm jumping a bit ahead. Why it's important as well is that when you host a SaaS application and you own the IP, one of the most interesting options available to you is the so-called self-hosted option. And it also requires either software assurance or subscription. And it's not limited to where you can host your solution. It can be anywhere. It can be hosted on any platform virtually. There are limitations, but in the majority of cases, you can do that. And therefore, flexible virtualization benefit and self-hosting eligibility, they always go hand in hand, with the only difference is that there are only few products that are eligible for self-hosting. But the majority of SaaS solutions that we deal with, again, I have to caveat it, they use Windows Server and SQL Server. And those products are both eligible for self-hosting and they have a flexible virtualization benefit also. In Azure, in Azure, of course, Microsoft left for themselves a very specific option of bring your own license, which is called Azure Hybrid Use Benefit. And compared to other providers, it may even be much more cost efficient than any other BYOL scenario. So from the licensing standpoint, in many cases, Microsoft Azure is more financially efficient. But that's not considering the other costs of services, bandwidth, storage. So obviously it needs to be considered together. And again, I'm not advertising Azure today. I'm just giving you the options. And for a hub, there are a few very interesting considerations that don't exist for any other BYOL scenario. So for Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, firstly, Windows Server data center licenses have dual use rights. So if you, for example, we recently worked with a provider that is partially on-premise in their own data center and partially in Azure. And they could, at the same time, because they were paying for Windows Server data center licenses with software assurance, use them on-premise for self-hosting for their SaaS applications that are still running in their data center. and at the same time assign them to virtual machines in Azure, effectively zeroing out the cost of licenses in Azure. So you only pay once, and then you can use it twice. It's not a cheap license, though, so considerations must be careful around it. So it's pretty good for Windows Server, a hub, not so cost efficient for SQL. It really depends on whether you are purchasing subscription licenses through CSP, or you have an old enterprise agreement and you just renew software assurance, therefore your cost is a fraction of the full subscription. When you consider a hub for SQL Server, always compare with the license included costs on Azure if we're talking about persistent workloads, VMs that never stop. The threshold there is not guaranteed, the positive threshold. Then obviously there's a scenario of your own SPLA. As I said, SPLA, Service Provider Licensing Agreement program, was designed by Microsoft for SaaS providers for some reason. And many SaaS providers, especially legacy SaaS providers, still have active service provider licensing agreements. I would say that in almost every case we assessed the cost efficiency of SPLA, unless you really need SPLA for something like Office, or maybe you use it to augment your solution for elasticity. SPLA is not the most cost-efficient solution. It's a part of the puzzle, but not the most cost-efficient solution as well. Not always, but again, majority of the cases. I always have to caveat with majority of the cases, because your situation may be unique. Your scenario may be unique. And you need to assess it, not just listen to what I'm saying right now. You need to kind of write it down and then look at your options. What options are available to you? And do a calculation. Ask for the prices. Look at what prices you're paying right now for your licenses. Look at what you're paying for pay-as-you-go. Have proper cloud management tools and compare the costs and find the solution that works for you, ultimately reducing your overall costs of licenses and cloud. And as I mentioned, self-hosting. I mentioned it already many times. So self-hosting is effectively the right for you to host your SaaS application using normal corporate, enterprise, or CSP licenses without dealing with SPLA in your own data center. Or, I checked it today, again, never trust my memory. I checked it again with the product terms today. Self-hosting applies to bring your own license as well. There are a few requirements for your solution to be eligible for self-hosting, but the majority of what we define as a SaaS, they are eligible. So the first requirement is you must own the IP, except for maybe some licensed, as Microsoft calls them, unsubstantial third-party components that you may use in your application. And there's no definition of what is not substantial. So use your own judgment. But usually common sense applies. So if you license 90% of your solution and you just put a dashboard on top of it, then probably it's not your own IP. The second requirement for self-hosting, which is in the majority of cases more cost efficient than SPLA, is there must be no direct access to the Microsoft software, so no RDP. But in SaaS, if it's a web app or a mobile app using API, it's implied. You don't provide, normally, direct access to Microsoft products. And products must be eligible for self-hosting. So Windows Server and SQL Server, for example, are eligible. Microsoft Office isn't. And that's one of the reasons you should get rid of it if it's still a part of your legacy solution. The additional consideration with planning is always in SaaS. If you've been running SaaS for a while, you know it. I don't have to remind you, but there's elasticity. There are elasticity requirements. There may be, if you're selling gifts, for example, or presents. If you're Amazon and you have the Amazon Day, Black Friday, obviously such events cause spikes in demand. And if you plan your SaaS application properly, you would plan for elasticity. So consider elasticity. Every time you think about a licensing scenario, consider how you're going to address elasticity. And self-hosting, for example, is not very elastic because you use your static, either perpetual or subscription licenses. But there are options now. There are options now for elasticity, and let's go into details. So let's go now one by one, scenario by scenario, and begin with own data center, so your own data center or dedicated hardware, except Amazon, Google, and Alibaba. So your own dedicated hardware, even either in your own data center or somewhere else, except for Amazon, Google, and Alibaba. And the options for licensing SaaS there are the following: SPLA, so SPLA, self-hosting, as mentioned before, and then a mixture of the two. You can actually mix them. So when I say Office cannot be part of your self-hosted solution, when it's dedicated hardware, you're allowed to mix various licensing programs when it's not shared. And therefore, you may decide to license Windows and SQL as for self-hosting. And if you still require Office, and if you can count the authorized users, and you are happy to pay the immense costs of Microsoft Office in such a solution, then you can license it through SPLA if you have SPLA. Why not? And for elasticity on premise, obviously you have the SPLA native elasticity, because SPLA is effectively a pay monthly licensing program. In November, your workloads go up by 300%. You spin up virtual machines, then you shut down them before the end of November. You only pay for that spike for November. It's simple. And interestingly enough, with Azure Arc, which we didn't consider before, but we started considering recently, you can have elasticity with traditional licenses. Well, strictly speaking, Azure Arc is not traditional licenses. These are pay-as-you-go models for licensing Microsoft products on premises via Azure billing. So you're billed through Azure, which also is affected by your savings plans, by your Azure commitment agreements. And right now, the only product that is enabled with Azure Arc is SQL Server. But in about October and November this year, Microsoft is about to release Windows Server 2025, which will have an option of Windows Server with Azure Arc, which will have an option of per-hour billing through Azure. And we expected to have, if you want to plan the costs, we expected to have the same difference as SQL with Arc versus SQL subscription. Take the CSP price, add 20% on top. That is your indicative price. Obviously, it's not the final. There's no public information. It's not yet final, but it's a good indication of what it could be, because Microsoft tends to make monthly subscriptions 20% more expensive than annual on every product. Almost, it's almost like a golden rule: 20%. When you need elasticity and you only need that workload, and by the way, compared with SPLA per hour, then it's a no-brainer. Unless you don't want to fiddle with Azure and be more locked in with Microsoft, it's up to you. Consider various options here. Dedicated hardware from listed providers. This is a big headache, by the way. This is an immense headache, which has no clear resolution right now, and I'll explain. If you want to host your SaaS solution on dedicated hosts from Microsoft, Amazon, not just Microsoft in this list, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Alibaba, then for Windows Server. Point number one, Windows Server through your own SPLA. If you have a SPLA, you can bring it to those solutions only until October 2025. And Microsoft hasn't provided the answer to the question of what are we going to do next. We're just not allowed to do it anymore. A little bit more than 1 year is left on that. So if you plan a new solution, try and avoid it. Then for self-hosting, if you want to bring your own corporate licenses, that is possible, but only for those licenses for Windows Server that were initially purchased. And then you could renew software assurance on them multiple times on an agreement that was signed before October 2019. So there must be old licenses on which you're still continuing to renew software assurance, because software assurance is required for that BYOL, plus software assurance is required for self-hosting. So no avoidance of SA. And then it depends on the provider. Other options depend on the provider, because from Amazon, you can procure their own Amazon managed instances, and only in that option, with license included for Windows Server, and run them, those images, managed images, specifically built by Amazon, on dedicated hosts. Google provides none. There's no option like that on Google. And unfortunately, I don't have information about Alibaba in this case. And then Azure, you have Azure Hybrid Use Benefit. Microsoft left themselves the most flexible options, which they didn't give to anybody else. SQL Server is a bit easier. So SPLA has the same limitation. You may only bring it until October 2025. However, for self-hosting, any SQL license with software assurance, so CSP is not included. Pay attention, please pay attention. So license exactly with software assurance, procured through the traditional licensing channels like enterprise agreement or, MPSA, open value, with active software assurance. They have the so-called licensability through software assurance rights. So you can take them to AWS and compare them with the AWS license included cost for SQL Server. They'll probably be cheaper. Not necessarily, but probability is high. Obviously, you have the option of Amazon managed instances. And on Azure, you have Azure Hybrid Use Benefit. So another option. And for elasticity, we find that native pay-as-you-go is the easiest to manage on such platforms, if you can use it. But also, by the way, which I didn't have prescripted, SQL with Azure Arc, Microsoft recently clarified that purely on the pay-as-you-go model, it may be used on a list of providers, which is good. Which is a good thing. So elasticity has another option built through Azure. The other frequent scenarios, as I said, it's hosting on Azure in shared virtual machines, just normal Azure virtual machines, not dedicated hosts, native VMs. And AHub is very cost efficient for Windows Server. So AHub, Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, bringing your own license for Windows Server on a subscription or with SA, provides up to, you're not necessarily going to get that discount, but up to 95% cost savings. On average, it'll be about 40% cost savings, still pretty substantial. So for Windows Server, Azure Hybrid Use Benefit is a no-brainer. With Azure, you need to remember, though, with AHub, is that you need to manage your AHub meticulously. Because what we find is with AHub is it's not really managed properly. The box is ticked when you procure a virtual machine. We have the license. But then it's not necessarily that you do have the license. That's the problem. So ensure that you have the licenses. Ensure that you have them. Do not assign licenses to development and test subscriptions. Please remember that. And on the positive side, remember that you don't need to procure additional licenses if you're already paying for a license with, say, on-premise. Windows Server data center licenses have dual use rights on-premise and in Azure. So, apologies, please bear with me. just looking at the comments. Nothing interesting yet, but yeah. I'll just remind you. So if you want if you want to ask any question, raise your hand on LinkedIn or type your question in the chat on YouTube. If you're watching it on YouTube, by the way, it's a video stream. If you prefer video to audio, sorry, I didn't tell you before. Okay then. In Azure, you should not forget, and actually in any other hosting provider, you should not forget about reserving workloads for persistent VMs. So reserved instances, don't forget about them. Azure saving plans don't always provide specific benefits for well-planned SaaS, because Azure savings plans, as opposed to reserved instances, are more like just a global saving plan. Just gives you a discount on anything that is not reserved. That you pay as you go, normal pay as you go rates. It's a discount from the pay as you go rates. But properly calculated savings plan, better using statistics from previous years, could help you with elastic workloads. So if you can predict your elastic workloads, if you can plan for them, you can use a savings plan for that. So why not? It's a good option. Elasticity is pay as you go. So elasticity in Azure is pay as you go. I'd like to remind you that you should not forget about the unique dev test benefits of Azure. If you want to run also alongside with your production SaaS application a dev test workload, remember that when every user on a dev test subscription, every user that uses it has a Visual Studio subscription, you don't need licenses for other Microsoft products. It's all included. So it's a very good option. Unfortunately, many forget about it and then pay for licenses that are not required. And the last option that I'd like to discuss is shared VMs on listed providers, Amazon, Google, and Alibaba. A Windows Server on those platforms is always pay as you go. It's included with the virtual machine, and there's no BYOL option. We expect that Microsoft may allow, as they did with SQL, may allow a BYOL option, which is not necessarily a license, but running Windows Server on listed providers in a shared environment using Windows Server with Azure Arc. So Azure Arc enabled Windows Server. Let's wait. Keeping my fingers crossed it's going to happen, because it's going to provide another cost management and saving option if it's implemented. You may bring your own SQL Server with software assurance, only with software assurance, no CSP subscriptions, and the self-hosting rights. So that's another consideration. Otherwise, just use SQL Server pay as you go that is provided by those platforms. And pay attention to requirements like Azure managed instances, for example, whether you can bring your own SQL, just install it and then pay as you go. I don't think you can do it on Amazon, but please correct me if I'm wrong. You know, you have the chat to tell me that I'm wrong, and please do that. The mistakes that most providers make are quite simple, quite obvious, but I'll go through them. So, and the mistake number one is not comparing options. It's not that we find that providers are lazy. What we find is that in the 99% cases when options are not compared and a company just goes, an organization just goes with one licensing option that they chose from the start, is they just don't know that there are options that are available. Like, nobody really presents this information the way I just presented it to you. There's no such information available. So educate yourselves. And you can follow us to educate yourselves. This is free. This is free information that we share easily. If you actually want our help, then obviously it's easy to find us. Our emails and links are everywhere. Just click, come, and let's talk. The other mistake that I must mention is inefficient planning for reservations and BYOL. Many cloud cost management tools to this day, and when I say many, over 90% of the cloud cost management tools have no options, no information about BYOL. They do manage cloud native costs. They do not necessarily manage, present you in a more or less digestible way included licensing costs, but they lack the visibility of cost savings via BYOL. They are not designed for it. They were never built for it. Newer tools that appear on the market, like challenger tools, they may not be as sophisticated, but there's a tendency to include that option. Finally we can have it in the tool. So if you use a cloud cost management tool and you host in the cloud, in many cases you would have to do the BYOL assessment yourself. Don't just trust what the tool tells you. And when I talk about planning reservations and savings plans, I already mentioned it, but I'll repeat. Persistent workloads always use reservations. It's a no-brainer. Elastic workloads, think about savings plans. Azure has its own savings plans. AWS has its own savings plans. Can't tell anything about Google and Alibaba, but I would imagine they would probably provide something like it. So don't forget that. The other mistake that we see is providers ticking AHAB box. Not just providers, actually many organizations, not necessarily providers, ticking the I have the license box on Azure Hybrid Use Benefit rights on every single VM they procure. There's a risk with that. Firstly, if you do buy those licenses and you track the quantity of licenses you click that you have, then you may overpay. You don't need those licenses for temporary workloads. You don't need those licenses for dev test subscriptions. So careful with that, please. But if you over commit, if you say, I have the license, but you don't, Microsoft currently does not audit that. They even said once that we don't have visibility of that. Do you believe that? It's their database. It's in their cloud. If Microsoft's growth stops being 20% year on year, they may start looking for additional revenue streams. That is, in our experience, in our understanding of Microsoft's behavior and the way Microsoft licensing works, that is going to be the quickest win for Microsoft, is to go and try and recover the cost of licenses that were claimed but never existed. So use, again, if you use a hub, manage it meticulously. If you use BYOL, manage it meticulously on any platform, especially on Azure. With bring your own license, one of the other mistakes is letting your software assurance or subscription expire and then forgetting to renew the subscription, because the reason for that mistake is FinOps teams, dev teams, sales teams, and software asset management teams don't talk to each other. So if something is used for BYOL, it must be in the visibility of at least the FinOps and IT teams. They must know that they're responsible for it. It's not just the software asset management guy or girl sitting somewhere in the corner quietly and managing licenses as a service that nobody cares of. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'll be blunt here, but unfortunately that happens. You have a risk of losing that. And the last mistake is using Microsoft partner licenses is prohibited. That is a ubiquitous mistake, especially for SaaS. You can't use them. For SaaS, you can't even use them on a shared hardware. So be careful. You, as a Microsoft partner, you may get specific benefits and so-called NFR licenses for partners. You can't, Microsoft Park licenses, you can't use them for production workloads like SaaS. Just can't. For your own internal purpose, yes, by all means, but not for SaaS. And I want to finish this with advice, what you need to do today, like simplest steps that you can take today. Firstly, assess your SaaS eligibility for self-hosting. If you don't use it yet, or even if you use it now, you may be not eligible. So assess your eligibility for self-hosting. Then draw a diagram of the current environment, detailed diagram of the current environment where you host your SaaS applications, and another one where you want to be in 1 or 3 years from now. So where you're going to migrate. The other thing you can start doing today is assess, review your corporate licenses, non-SPLA. What do you have? What subscriptions you have? What software assurance you have? How many? What types of licenses? Again, you will probably be concentrating on Windows Server and SQL Server. Do not ever cancel software assurance just because you want to cancel software assurance. Just because procurement said, why are we paying for software assurance? Don't cancel it until you assessed whether you may either now or the nearest future bring your own license and compare the costs. Because if you cancel it, you will have to repurchase the license again with software assurance. And when you, by the way, when you plan for a long term, always compare subscription costs with a more expensive upfront perpetual license with SA that then becomes less expensive after 3 years. So that's another consideration that you may start thinking about today as well. It's not rocket science. It's a simple planning with Microsoft Excel. And if you want help, you know where to find us. And if you already use SPLA and you're eligible for self-hosting, what I would advise you to do is compare the cost of moving your persistent workloads to self-hosting. In the long term, it will be cheaper than SPLA. And if you always dreamt of getting rid of SPLA, and as much as I like it, it's not ideal, it may be your option. On this note, I'll start answering your questions, and I have the first question in the YouTube chat. Hi, Alex. How to mark dev test Windows VMs in Azure to save money with Visual Studio? You don't mark virtual machines. You create dev test subscriptions. At least in enterprise agreement subscriptions, and there are specific dev test subscriptions through Visual Studio, but let's not talk about them. So under an enterprise agreement, you have an option of creating a dev test subscription. Where I'm still lacking clarity is the dev test payment plans through CSP. I think maybe that's where you may just flag specific virtual machines for dev test. Let me take this question as a homework, and we'll publish soon an article about it. But we have an article on the pipeline that talks about dev test in Azure. And things are changing. So far, enterprise agreement subscriptions are more flexible in that regard. Any more questions? Daryl, do you want to add a couple words maybe? I have my business partner Daryl with me today, but I'm not sure whether he's still listening.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I was on mute. Well, I just want to add on general business remark. Sasha went into a lot of technical licensing advantages to increase your profitability around Microsoft licensing, around SaaS profitability. I want you to keep in mind that yes, licensing is super important. There's actually a lot of money there. And if it's managed correctly, you can increase your profitability substantially. Yet, what we find many times is that what's overlooked is actually correct billing. So in addition to getting your business in line and optimizing your licensing, you need to make sure that when you bill your end customers, when you invoice them, you have all the required data and understand the pricing metrics that go into that. We see too often that IT or the back-end infrastructure is being managed really well, but there's a disconnect between the business that's actually doing the billing and invoicing and the infrastructure side of the business that's provisioning the service. And the bigger the gap, or the less of the communication between the two groups, the less profitable the organization is going to be, and more errors are going to be made with the end customer invoicing. So I just want to leave you with that small piece of information that you take back to your business, and make sure that all communication lines are open and information flows continuously between the groups. That's all I have to add. Thank you very much for a great session, Sasha.
Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, everybody who's with us today. We have a pretty substantial crowd today on both platforms, LinkedIn and YouTube. The next event that we're going to hold is it's a Daryl's event. So please go to Daryl Ullman's page on LinkedIn and look up his events. It will be in 2 weeks from now, the 28th. And Daryl will talk about negotiating unified support, which may or may not be relevant to SaaS companies, but it's a Microsoft support package that they try and sell to every organization, mostly large organizations. And if you want to optimize its costs, then I suggest to join that event that Daryl will host in a couple of weeks from now. On this note, you can find us at SAMexpert.com. All the links will be in all the descriptions everywhere on YouTube and LinkedIn. And I hope you learned something today. I hope you will take those action items that I suggested you to take home, and you'll start improving your SaaS costs and SaaS profitability tomorrow, or even today, if you're in America, for example, and good morning to you. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you on all our channels almost every week, almost every Wednesday. Goodbye. By the way, Keith, sorry, I didn't see you if you were holding a hand. Did I not notice? I apologize then.